This is part 3 of the Fay Jones School of Architecture and Design Cuboid, and as you can see, I've got the mold mounted to a cradle. Now you might ask, why did I build this fancy cradle without showing you how I did it? And the answer to that is that every mold you make is different. And I don't know what your machine looks like. So the cradle that hooks your mold to your machine is completely custom built. So I thought, instead of taking you through the steps of me building this exact cradle, which is just made out of cardboard and duct tape and a little bit of Magic Sculpt, instead of taking you through the steps of building this particular cradle, I thought it would be better to go over some principles of cradle design, some basic ideas about rotational molding that you can apply to any shape of mold, to any machine. They're all the same. So let's do that. I've mounted everything together, and now I'm going to take it apart and deconstruct what I've done as I go along here. First thing you notice is that it rotates very nicely. It's very smooth. It's very easy to control. It is so much fun. I love rotational molding. It is so much fun. And I think it's more fun to do it by hand because you have so much more control over the machine, and because you're involved and you're feeling your way and everything's beautiful. So let's look at what I've got here. Let's look at what I've done. The mold is held onto the cradle basically with just 2 rubber bands. This one crisscross rubber bands, as you can see. These hooks I made, see those hooks I just made out of coat hanger wire. Just so simple, so low tech, no problem at all. There's our little bunghole. That's where we're gonna pour the resin in. And we have, if you'll recall, we'll get it out in a minute, we have the white cap for that. You can see that the mold is closed with rubber bands all around. I just used rubber bands on my epoxy clay cleats to hold everything together, and that is working like a champ. One of the most important things that you're going to do when you design a cradle is you want the whole machine to balance. We're not talking here about huge forces. This machine at this level does not require that kind of level of balance. So frankly, I just winged this cradle. I built it, I kind of looked, I held the mold kind of where I wanted on the machine. As a point of principle, what you want ideally is you want the mold to be centered right in between with the 2 axes, because you've got this axis of rotation and you've got this axis of rotation. And in a perfect world, those axes of rotation would pass perfectly through the center of your mold. And the only reason for that, from a rotation standpoint, it doesn't make a bit of difference if your mold is rotating tightly around a center or if it's rotating like this. It doesn't make a bit of difference in terms of coating the inner walls. It's fine, but it does make a difference in terms of how out of balance your machine is. And the machine just runs smoother, and it's easier and less stressful if you balance it as best you can. I'm pretty happy with the balance on this axis right here, and across this axis. I'm pretty happy with that. But I didn't do so great with the balance across this axis. If you really look at it, you can see that most of the weight of this is well above this axis, going in this direction. It's like coming in through down here. That's not so great. If I had to do it over, I would redesign the cradle to lower it down. But here's the thing, like everything else in mold making, it's a trade-off. How much time and energy and work are you going to put into designing and building a cradle for something that you only make a few castings for? If this was a big mold, if it was heavy, if it was a high production mold, I would invest the time and energy in the molds and in the cradle and in the setup, because over a long production run, that investment will pay for itself over and over again. If you're doing a project like this and you're only going to make a few castings, how many hours do you want to spend designing and redesigning and testing a cradle? It isn't worth it, and I'll show you why. Mounted on the machine with no help, this cradle is out of balance, but it's not hard to balance the machine, and the secret to that, for me, is C-clamps. C-clamps are the simplest way I've ever found to balance a mold. These 4 clamps are enough weight to counterweight the mold on that side. And also, these clamps here are enough weight, just these 4 little black clamps are enough weight to when I let go, and you can tell, that's pretty good. Now what happens if I take one of those off? Maybe even better. You can use clamps, put them around on your frame, and get the thing to balance with amazingly precise with almost no work and no time investment. Highly recommend, if you're going to do rotational molding, generally speaking, a couple of clamps does it in the right position, and you can mount them in various points around the machine. The farther away you mount them from the center of the machine, the more effect they have, just like, you know, the fat kid on the seesaw has to sit really close to the fulcrum to balance out the skinny kid. It's the same idea. The further the weight is from the center of the machine, the more effect it has on the balance. So it was very easy and quick for me to find a reasonable degree of balance for this mold. The cleats that hold the rubber bands in are just made out of epoxy clay. These cleats on the side, you can see right here, same thing. It seemed like the theme of this mold was epoxy clay cleats. So I just went with it and continued using it. The cradle itself, I built out of a box dug out of the recyclo bin, was free. I had a roll of duct tape. The duct tape is just insurance, a little bit of an insurance policy that says the thing's not going to fly apart. Duct tape is unbelievably strong. This is not going anywhere. And the whole thing I just glued together with Tide Bond. Very simple, very quick, very effective, and it's going to work. I'm going to make sure my mold's neatly aligned, getting the mold halves perfectly together, because if the mold halves are together where you can see them on the outside of the mold, you have a reasonable chance of knowing that inside the mold your parting line is well aligned and is going to make a small parting line. And that's the whole game here. And one last thing, one of my favorite things in the world, blue painter's tape. Love this stuff. And what I use it for is, one of the things that makes me mental when I'm spinning a mold, hear that? That little clicky clack of these clamps going clicky clacky makes me mental, easily solved. Take a little piece of blue painter's tape, put it on each one, and you're done. No more clicky clack. That's why I love stuff like that. Very simple. If you know me, I like simple. I like easy. I don't want to work hard. I just want to get the thing done with a minimum fuss, and away we go. It's time to put some resin in this mold. This is all this work has led up to this moment, and we have to see if this is going to work. Who knows if we're going to get good castings? So now I've got to mix some resin and pour it in here, but the question is, how much resin do I mix? So in this case, we have our handy model. And because we have this model, I weighed it, and I'm going to call it 200 grams. That's close enough. 200 does not divide very well by 3, so I'm going to, and I want to pour in 3 separate pours. And let's stop for a minute and talk about why. Why don't I just pour in 200 grams? 100 of A, 100 of B, mix it up, 200 grams, one shot, pour it, spin it, it's done. Why don't I do that? Well, here's why. Here's my beautiful mold, my model of my beautiful mold. This jar represents my mold, and the liquid inside of it represents the resin that I poured in. And maybe it's a little too much. Typically, I'd say, at the most, a quarter of the total volume of the mold for a rotational mold, maybe a little less even, depending on how thin or how thick you wanted the walls. But look what happens if you pour in a big volume, say a single shot. Keep your eye on the material. What do you see? What are you seeing when I do this? Let me do it like this. What do you guys see when I do this? What does that look like? Do you see what the problem is? You notice how the material all stays together in a lump. It all stays together in one big mass. See this mass? That isn't going to work. That is not going to work. But what's going to happen is, as that spins around, this resin in that lump is going to kick. It's going to cure, and it's going to cure in a lump. And then what are you going to have? You got this now mass of curing resin. It's very sticky. It's a big ball. It's rolling itself. It's rolling itself into a baseball. And now you got a really thin, less cured coating of resin on the inside walls of your mold, but you've got this sticky baseball rolling around clunk, 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 clunk inside of the mold, and it cleans the mold off very nicely. And so you rotate and rotate, and also you're listening to what is that pa-tunk sound inside of my mold? And you open your mold, and you have a really nice little baseball of resin and a perfectly clean mold on the inside. It has happened to me many times. There's nothing funnier than telling a beginning rotational molding person that that's what's going to happen, watching them pour in a big volume. It's not going to happen to me. I understand rotational molding. It's about centrifugal force. It's not about the resin coating the mold. It's about centrifugal force. Let's find out if you really want centrifugal force, shall we? Let's gotta really spin it fast for centrifugal force. Gotta make it nice and fast. Uh-oh, what do you notice when you spin a mold really fast? What do you got? Nothing but bubbles. Bubbles, 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 bubbles. The last thing you want to do is whip around. Spin, spin, spin. Centrifugal force. Let's whip it around. Absolutely will not work, will give you nothing but bubbles. It's a mess. What you want is gentle, slow rotation of enough material, just enough to coat the walls evenly in the interior of the mold. You get one shot, then you pop the little cap off, you pour the second shot in, you do the same thing, and you build a nice wall thickness in successive coats of resin. That's why that's why hand roto casting works, because you can do it. You can really control the speed of the rotation. You can do it at a nice pace. You can pay attention to what part of the mold is being coated, and you have total control over it. You know, if you motorize a rotational molding machine, you better have a very, very powerful and sophisticated computer controlling the rotation and the direction of rotation and the speed of rotation and everything about the rotation, because if you don't, you're just not going to get good castings. Fortunately, your brain is a very, very, very sophisticated and powerful computer, and you can control a rotational frame far better than any computer can, because you can think about the shots that you're pouring in and what's happening. You can visualize in your head what's happening inside that mold, and you can make really nice rotational castings. All that said, we don't know if we're going to get really nice rotational castings, because remember what I said, we got nothing but sharp points. So I'm going to do this first shot, and the reason I'm going to do it is if I'm right, I'm going to catch a lot of bubbles in these points. Watch me be right. Watch this thing make a liar of me. I get a perfect shot the first time out of the mold. But I'm expecting that there's a reasonable possibility I'm going to have bubbles inside these sharp points. And if I do, I'll show you how we're going to defeat them. I've mixed up a 66-gram batch, 33A, 33B, made it a nice orange color so you guys could see it come out of the mold. And let's mix, mix, mix. We don't have a long time. We want to get it mixed. Done. So I have paper on the table. I can already feel it's getting warm. So let's pour it. Okay, it's poured. Where's my cap? Here's my cap. Hope this cap fits in there. Oh, it fits like a champ. Got a little rubber band crossing the cap, and let's go. Let's go, go, go. Let's go, go, go. Let's go, 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 go. Let's go, go. See what I mean? I'm just giving it nice, easy, gentle rotation. Nothing too violent, nothing too horrible. No spills at all. That's pretty miraculous. Liking that a lot. No spills at all. I'm going to do what I always do, and that's keep my eyeballs on the witness cup. Still rotating around pretty good. Still moving around. I think I see clamps coming loose in my progress here. This one looks like it's coming a little loose. I can tighten up my clamps. I still have control over the machine. I'm still doing just random movements and rotations, making sure everything's staying tight. As long as you keep the thing rolling, you're moving it around. And that's all you need to do. Now, if anything, when I do this, I'm going to favor the side of the mold away from the nozzle. That way I don't make too big a thick a cover over the bung hole. By the way, a bung is a hole in a wine cask or a barrel. So that's an old word. I did not make it up. I did not get it from Beavis and Butthead or whoever. Everything's staying put nicely. Well, let's see how we're doing. Witness cup is still letting this stuff, it's syrup now. It's not with milk, it's syrup, which means it's still flowing, which means you still want to be moving it around. By moving it around, it can't do anything except coat the walls. It won't pool in any one place. There's not enough resin in that container to pool. Just isn't. Let's get these sticks up off of here. They're also telling me how it's doing. It's sticky, but it's not cured. So we'll keep going. Let's check our witness cup one more time. Okay, now it's getting to the point where it's pretty well gelled. All right, this has been sitting a while. I poured the 3 shots, the 2 more exactly the way you saw me pour the first one, 66 gram batches. 66 times 3 is something close to 200. And let's see. Witness cup tells us we're rock hard and we're ready to go. Okay, now this is a test casting. This is purely a test casting. And what we're looking for is how do we do on the bubbles and whether or not this shell is going to hold too tight to the mold and we're going to, you know, ding or bend or warp or do something not good to the casting, getting it off. We don't know. We have no idea if we're facing catastrophic failure or if we're going to have a nice casting. Who knows? We won't know until we know. All right, here we go, boys and girls. I think it's better to take the rotator out of my face. We'll just pop it off its clamps, drop it down. Handy dandy, easy to move, super lightweight. Let's pop these bands off. See what's what. They did a great job. The cleats worked great. Everything looks really good from the outside. But you don't know until you know now. Yeah, still looks really good. But the question is, can we get this off of here? Let's see if we can pull it apart. Oh, that looks like that's going to come out all right. That's coming off easy enough. All right, got that off. That looks good. Now, this part, the second half, that's the hard part. Question is, can we get that off of there? But let's see, before we do anything, let's find out if this is going to pop off. Let's see how it goes. Looks like it, yeah, looks like it might come. All right, I'm going to pull the rubber blanket off on this side. And let's see what we can see here. Okay, let's see if I can get this rubber blanket off. Oh, ooh, look at that. All right. Well, okay, that's even better than I thought it would be. Let's see, can I pull it this way? Let's see, we can see, okay, oh no, the shell's gonna come right off. No worries, shell's coming out, there you go. Shell came off, yeah, wow. That's better than I thought it was gonna be. I gotta tell you, it's not as horrendous as I thought it was gonna be. There are pin bubbles. Let's see if it comes out. That's good, little pin bubbles. Okay, now down here on this edge, down here where I was worried about it, that's where I felt like I cut the mold bad. And can you see that? Can you see that? Let me see if I get you closer. Can you see the flashing coming off of there? That's going to be the worst flaw in the whole mold. That's just where I missed when I cut the mold. And the parting line is just a little off that edge. Now the other edge over here, that's looking really pretty good. Not bad at all. Boy, I'm pleased about how that came out. I'm going to say that the part that I'm least happy about is this edge right here. You can see that the parting line really missed on that edge. Here on the other side, man, that edge is pretty nice. I missed it a little bit right in there, but it's pretty darn nice, certainly within the tolerances. I mean, if you look at the flaws overall. But now look at the pin bubbles. See all those little tiny pin bubbles? That's all about what resin that's foaming. Now there are some pin bubbles in the corners exactly where we expected them to be. You can see right there, there are some pin bubbles. That's exactly where I predicted they would be, out on those points. It's really, really hard, but you know what? A lot of those points and a lot of those edges are really clean. I am pretty pleased. The amount of cleanup is not too bad, and I'll show you some techniques for cleaning them up and making it better. To talk about the flaws in a rotational casting, you have to start by talking about the invisible flaw, the flaw you cannot see, and that is how uneven the wall thickness is. I'm holding the camera up to the light, and it clearly illustrates the problem. See those bright orange sections? That's where the resin is paper thin. It's in the points that stick into the mold. The deepest valleys on the outside become the highest points on the inside, and the resin flows away from those high points, and so the seams, those bright orange lines, are very, very, very weak sections. Now look at the dark sections. Look at where you see the really dark resin. The reason that it's dark there is that the resin is thick there, and that's at the outside points. So these areas, the outer edges, the parts that stick out, fill up with resin, and the parts that stick in, like this crease, stick into the mold, the resin runs away. I'll diagram it, show you what I mean, but you can clearly see the problem. Let's look at what's going on inside that cavity. So here's my mold. The blue's the rubber mold, got a shell on the outside, inside cavity, got the little plug, so we're all set to go. So now what happens when you pour resin into a mold like this? As you rotate it around, what happens is, the tendency is for the resin to do this. So this is what the resin wants to do. It wants to basically flow away from the high, it wants to flow away from the high spots. And it wants to fill up these spots, the projections. So the outer projections, the outer points, become very solid and very thick. And the points here are starved, are paper thin, and that you saw that because that's where you saw the light areas. Right here is where you saw the light areas, and right here is where you saw the dark areas. That's why the best way to fill a mold, a rotational mold, is to put in just enough resin to coat the inner wall. So you put in a thing of resin, and you just want to coat the inner wall. You don't want a lot of pooling resin inside, a big giant thing. You saw that in that jar. Then second coat, same thing. You build it up. Now you saw in my casting, I still got starved points here. It's still going to want to tend to fill out the areas like this. Even when you're putting in layers, it wants to fill in like this and starve the high points. That's just the nature of it. That's why I've always said a shape like this is no good. What you need is a shape where everything's rounded. The more you can round over corners, the better it works in rotational molding. If you look at things that are rotational molded, like a lot of toys are made this way, kayaks, like big plastic kayaks, things like that. Start looking at things that are clearly blow molded or rotational molded. You won't see a lot of sharp edges. What you're going to see is everything has a radius. All the edges, everything has a radius. And so it should be with this. This was not designed for resin casting or rotational molding. There's not a radius in sight. It's 90 degrees everywhere you look. And that's a problem. And so how could you overcome that? How could you make this stronger? Well, one way would be to fill it with some foam. Put about a charge of foam in there and rotate and push around and let it foam up and fill up those areas where the points are and make the thing a lot stronger. Next problem to solve on rotational castings is the pore hole. And how do you deal with the pore hole? How do you make sure it gets sealed up? In this casting, I can see that my resin is razor thin. And so I'll tell you how I would solve that in a minute, but I'll tell you how I should have solved it while I was pouring it. And that is, let's say you're going to pour 3 shots of resin into your mold. You're going to have to be able to take the pour spout, the plug, out 3 times to get the resin in. And what I do is I keep an X-Acto blade knife handy, and I pop and between pours, I pop the plug out and then cut open, if I need to, and I usually do, cut open the little web, the little film of resin that's blocking the hole. Just cut it out. And I do that 3 times, but now you have a hole, or in this case, like this is really paper thin. This resin here is quite thin under that hole. If I sand this down, I'm going to open that up. So how the hell do I fix that? So the best way to do it is when you're casting the pieces, after you've made your 3 casts, you're going to do 1 more cast. And what you do is you pour the resin in, and then you put the plug back in, and then you position the mold so that all the resin runs down to where the plug is. So you get a nice thick spot of resin around your plug. It's really a handy way to do that, and you know you've got a nice support, because then when you pop the plug out like this needs to be sanded and smoothed and cleaned up, but there really isn't enough material here. So what happens if you screw it up, as I did here? What do? Well, you do the exact same thing. To fix this, I would drill it out. I would put that smaller charge of resin in there, say a 40-gram batch, and I would just put a piece of tape, like blue painter's tape or masking tape, over the hole. Again, turn it upside down and let the resin cure against the tape, and it works out just fine. What you want is you want a nice little blob of resin where the hole is so you can sand it smooth. And obviously, if you were making a colored casting, you would do it with the same color resin, so everything would match. Let's talk about holes in the casting, specifically bubble holes. Bubbles! So what's the best way to fix little bubbles? Because you're going to have them, you might as well figure out how to fix them. In a colored casting, the easiest way is to simply, at the time you've made the casting, you probably have some unmixed resin still in the cups. So you mix up a small amount of the same color resin. I usually take a sharp, fine-pointed tool and just pick up a drop of the mixed colored resin and just drop it and fill each bubble. Mostly that will work because the resin does bond to itself. Once in a while you get a situation where it won't work, and who knows, you got to test your resin, but this kind of resin I use, that can often be successful. If you don't do it as I did it here, what are your options? They aren't very good. They're few and they're not very good. One is, here's the cured cups resin. I just tore one of the cups apart, and I tore out the cured resin out of the bottom of the cup. And then I use that with some sandpaper, like so. And I make a nice little amount of the sanded resin. And what you can do with that, you mix it with your handy dandy clear 5-minute epoxy and make a paste. And you can use that paste to fill all of your little holes. Now, is that going to match the color of this perfectly? No, it won't. It does a reasonably good job. It's okay, but it's not going to give you a perfect blemish-free fix. It just isn't. Because here's the thing about urethane resins. As they age over time, they change colors. The color gets more yellow, and it gets deeper and darker. Urethane resin changes colors. It's not permanent. The absolute best way to finish a resin casting is to paint it. I have models and toys and sculptures that I have had for 30, 35 years that are painted resin. They're still in perfect condition. They look brand new. And here's the thing. No matter what I do to this, if I sand these edges, if I do anything to them, I'm going to change the look that they have now. In some ways, I will argue that it's better just to leave the little flaws in there. Because the more you try to fix the little flaws on something that you're not going to paint, the more you're going to see them. Look at the color of sanded resin. Look at the color of the resin. No matter what, if I sand this, it's going to make it lighter in color. Then if I go back to polish it back out to the original surface, it's going to make it a different color. It's not going to match. The more you do to it to try to fix it, the more trouble you make for yourself every time. This is why I'm such a fanatic about parting lines and bubbles. Because I want things to come out of the mold as perfect as you can make it so that you absolutely minimize all of the nonsense you have to do to fix it, clean it, all that stuff. Not my idea of fun. Highly recommend you avoid it. If you like this video, watch this video next. And keep your projects coming, keep your questions coming, keep your comments coming. You know I love hearing from you guys, and I will see you next week.